We are in Zagreb, Croatia for the Superunited Blitz 2025. We are looking at the game of Praggnanandhaa taking on Magnus Carlsen. Prag comes in and he's been having a pretty decent day at the office. Could have been better, but Magnus Carlsen is absolutely on a roll. He scored 5.5 out of 7, unbeaten with 4 wins and 3 draws. And there you have it. The players shake hands and Magnus sits down. Both of them will be representing the same team in the Esports World Cup. The Team Liquid is what they will play for, and this is going to be super exciting, this clash between Praggnanandhaa and Magnus. Who's going to come out on top? We'll wait and watch. The arbiters ask them to shake hands and start the clock, and this, dear friends, is the ambit recap of the day. Prag opens the game with b3 and Magnus plays e5. b3 has become Prag's favorite weapon in these blitz encounters in the Grand Chess Tour. e3 played, opening up his bishop here, and Magnus goes g6 to put the bishop on g7. Prag takes his time here. He has a few options how to play against this. He can already push d4, he can play his knight out, he can also push c4. And amidst all of this, he's thinking h4, h5 might not be that silly as it looks. Prag not rushing it in the opening, takes his time. And this one plays his move after nearly 30 seconds. Bishop comes to g7, knight f3 played. And Magnus adjusts his pieces. There's some pressure on the e5 pawn, and one of the ways to continue is d6. The other is that you put your knight on e7. Knight e7, castles. Well, knight f6 may not be a great idea because he would take here in the center and you would lose a pawn. And it's Magnus's turn now to think, and he goes knight to e7. One very interesting line here is b4. When you take here, then the pawn in the center is lost, but Prag goes d4, pawn takes pawn, knight takes, he castles here. Well, now knight takes c6, and then bishop g7 would be a good idea, but he goes bishop e2. Prag trying to finish off his development, get quickly castled, then knight to c3, and I believe that he would have a very small edge here. Magnus takes, bishop takes, bishops are traded, queen comes in the center, and pawn to d5 played. Prag can take on d5, but then queen takes d5, and black is doing quite well. So maybe get your knight out to c3. So knight to c3. And Magnus thinking about how to deal with this tension. He takes on c4. D takes c4 taken. Queen takes d8. Rook takes d8. Bishop comes out to c4. And this position is very interesting because there is some kind of an imbalance here. White has 2 pawns against 3. So black has a queenside majority while white has a central majority here, 4 versus 3. So there's something to play for. And also it does feel like white's position is much more cohesive. You know, king e2, he can try to start playing in the center, maybe push his pawns on the king side. Knight goes to f5. And Magnus maybe wants to put his knight on d6, hitting the bishop on c4. There's also a possibility to start pushing the pawn, h-pawn on the king side. Magnus taking his time for knight f5. He has 3 minutes 34 seconds while Praggnanandhaa has around 4 minutes on the clock. He comes up king e2, knight goes back to d6. And now the bishop can drop back here, or you can play bishop d5, c6 and put the bishop back on f3. He goes bishop d3. The bishop comes out to e6. Black is happy with his position. Maybe now rook c1 is possible. There's also rook hd1 possible. Pragg thinks about his move. He plays rook hd1. And now Magnus Carlsen has to decide how to continue his game. c5 is one possibility. He goes f5. Tries to gain space in the center. Rook goes to c1. And pawn to c6. So the knight jumps to a4 to c5. He plays his pawn to h4, king f7. And now h5 is surely something that Pragg is thinking about. This h4, h5 is a very interesting plan that Pragg came up with. If you push your pawn to h5, can black go g5? Possible. So Pragg has to calculate that. He does play h5, and of course taking the pawn would be bad because of rook h1. He goes king f6. And now white can take hg. Well, both players actually having this great intent to fight in this equalish position, which is what makes this game very exciting. Pragg takes on g6, hg6, and brings his rook to h1. Magnus can also bring his rook to h8. That is possible. Once he does that, they are fighting for the h file, but Magnus says it's not important. I'm going to fight in the center for central squares. So he goes knight f7, and he wants to come to e5, attacking d3. Rook h7 is possible. Then knight e5. So knight f7. Pragg is deciding where is his next bit of counterplay coming from. I mean, g4 is something you can think about, takes and then knight e4 check. No, he goes rook d1. Tries to defend this bishop. Knight e5 could be played here. Rook h7 then is possible. Magnus has 3 minutes, roughly 3 minutes on the clock. Pragg down to 1 minute 42 seconds. He plays rook d7. He's doubling down the d file. Bishop goes to c2, takes on d1. He takes back rook d1. And now rook to h8 played by Magnus. He wants to perhaps come here. It's interesting how black wanted the d file, white had the h file, and now it has shifted hands. g5 played by Magnus. And Pragg is going ahead with his king, king f3. If g4 is played, king here, white is better. e4 is coming up. Magnus thinking about what to do now with this tension here. Should he trade? Should he push? He takes on f4, a good decision. The pawn on f5 has become a bit weak now. Takes, a5 played. Maybe knight a4 to c5, but there's this bishop d5 check, which could be quite irritating. So the knight needs to remain here. And Pragg needs to start speeding up. He has less than a minute left on the clock. Not much time. He goes bishop d3 with 50 seconds. Magnus 2 minutes 20 seconds. And pawn to b5. Pushing through here on the queen side. Magnus trying to create his own set of counterplay. King f2. I like this move actually, because you want to play your bishop to e2 and then to f3 and put pressure on the c6 pawn. That's one of the ideas why he played his king back. And for Magnus, if you go b4, I have knight a4. Also, it moves away from the check here. So king f2, excellent move. He goes a4, and I really love this move. Because if you take here, I have b4, the knight moves, then the a4 pawn is super weak. ba4 might be forced, yeah? Like, what else do you do? Pragg goes b4. And Magnus quickly pushes his pawn to a3, separating these two pawns. It's a very, very double-edged move, because this pawn on a3 could also become weak, and you might want to take it. But for now, a2 is super weak. So both sides have their problems. And these are the games where nothing happens for several moves. It looks like super dull. And then all of a sudden, there is less time. Both players want to win. And it becomes super sharp. Now, Pragg down to 29 seconds. Meanwhile, Magnus has roughly a minute on the clock. He's using his time now. He's making sure that he makes his use of his time. He comes down to 1 minute 14 seconds. Rook d2 played here to defend the pawn on a2. And Magnus goes king to e7. Now can we push c5 at some point? The b5 pawn is under pressure. With rook d2 he has defended, so his knight can move. Bishop a2 no longer a threat. Well, what is Pragg thinking here? He's down to like last 5 seconds or so. He plays bishop f3 with just 6 seconds on the clock. Insane. Knight comes to d6. Bishop, knight e2 played. Coming to d4, attacking the bishop and the pawn. Well, the knight could jump to c4 here. That is possible and a good move. You could also think about going to e4 and giving up your knight for the bishop. Magnus thinking hard here. The position is not easy. Do we have an option to push the pawn to c5 as well? And now down to 30 seconds. Magnus less than 30 seconds on the clock. Needs to make a decision. But Pragg has only 5 seconds. Anything can happen here. And Magnus shaking his head, plays c5 with just 12 seconds, trades, knight comes to d4. Pragg was super quick. He was anticipating Magnus's c5. Bishop goes to c4. And Magnus is like, wow, I used a lot of my time. Check. He's not feeling a bit sure about this. Has less time, plays king d7. Pragg jumps with knight b4. He could have also jumped to e5. King comes to e6. And rook c2. A good move. Pinning. Rook goes back to c8. Rook c3. Now a3 is hanging. You can't go here. This is hanging. So he plays this. Takes the pawn. Rook h8. Pragg is better now. He's clearly in the driver's seat. He goes rook a6. Pins the knight. Rook h1 played. Both players down to their last seconds. Rook a1. Pragg brings his king in. Beautiful decision. King d7, king d4. He's playing this very well. Magnus can't even find a move here. He goes to check. King up. Knight c2, knight e3 would have been nice. Knight c6. King goes to f6. Knight e5. But rook a6, a mistake. Magnus finds it. b4. Praggnanandhaa shaking his head because the rook is attacked. He goes rook b6, takes. Knight b4. King goes back. Bishop d5. They're playing super quick. And now king to e5 played. Magnus plays another check. King here a2. Magnus seems to have found the winning idea. Oh my god, he sacrifices another check. King e3. He takes the bishop. Knight c3. Knight c4 check. King goes to e2. And he gives a check. Takes here. Takes on g2. Check here. And in the end, the game ends with Magnus winning. Praggnanandhaa can't believe that he lost this game. He had his chances. Magnus also not so thrilled with that victory. But a win is a win. And Pragg, well, he just can't believe that he lost that game, but the time scramble was super intense. Let's just figure out what happened when the time ran low. In this position, Praggnanandhaa played the move rook c2, a very shrewd move, but look at this, he has 4 seconds, Magnus has 5. His idea is rook c3 to attack the pawn on a3. Magnus plays rook c8 here, and rook comes up to c3, attacking the pawn. There's no way to defend it, maybe knight e4 makes some sense, but Magnus goes rook d8. First step in the wrong direction, Pragg takes the pawn. Now knight e4 is very important. Takes, and here it's a fighting position. Anything can happen. But instead he goes rook h8, and now Pragg is completely better. He pins the knight. Magnus jumps in with the rook. Both players are making moves whatever they can because they hardly have time. Rook a1, king comes up. Excellent chess, king d7. Another king move, beautiful move. He goes rook e1. And now if king c5, which could be playable and a good move, could be met with knight e4. But Pragg goes check. King e6, and now knight jumps to c6. He plays his king to f6 and rook a6. This was a key error. If he would have found knight e5, Pragg had excellent winning chances. In fact, in this position, instead of going knight to c6, there were also possibilities to actually move here the knight to c2 and then knight e3. That was also possible to play later. But okay, knight c6, king f6, rook a6 and b4. Magnus was super alert here with just 4 seconds attacking the rook. He went rook b6. Maybe there were other possibilities like rook a4, but rook b6 took the pawn. Now this is very dangerous pawn, but he goes knight b4. The pin is here, king e7, and now knight d5 was important at this point. But instead Pragg played bd5, which was a blunder. a2 would have sealed the game, which actually happened in the game, but after a check, king e5, check, king here, and now he played a2. So Magnus did find the right move, but it gave Pragg an opportunity here that when there was a check, he could have gone king c5. And this variation is insane because after a2 here, you basically allow him to queen. Rook takes d6, queen here, knight c6 check, king has to go back to f8, rook d8 check, king g7, rook d7, king h6, rook d6 check, king h5, bishop f3 check, king h4, rook d1, and white is holding balance here. Just a variation to show you the craziness. But he went king e5 and allowed a2. He took here, and now Magnus again found the best move. Rook d1 check, king e3, and this is where bishop takes d5 was played. He went knight to c3, but by now the position was lost. He gave a checks and here picked up the rook, and before you knew it, it was the knights were getting traded and Magnus is completely winning here. It was a game filled with very intense time pressure, but these were the moves that were played, and I think both players showed quite some accuracy with very less time on the clock, but in the end, it was Magnus who triumphed.